42 var inne.
Ja, hjälp! Verktygsgatan 2B, Arboga. 3 personer. Emma blöder jättemycket. Vad fan har hänt? Emma.
On the surface, Arboga was the kind of town people moved to when they wanted peace, safety, and predictability. The streets, on that March night in 2008, were nearly silent, blanketed by a thin layer of snow that reflected the dim yellow glow of the streetlights. It was the sort of silence that felt protective, almost sacred. Families tucked their children into bed, neighbors locked their doors, and the town seemed to exhale into the kind of calm that promised nothing bad could ever happen here. But behind one door, a story was about to unfold that would shatter that illusion forever. Inside a modest home, the warmth of the kitchen contrasted sharply with the winter air outside. Emma Jungastig, only 23 years old, yet already carrying the quiet strength of a young mother, stirred pots on the stove while keeping a careful eye on the clock. Her fiancé, Thorn, would be home from work soon, and she wanted the evening to be ordinary, routine, comforting. Beside her on the counter sat a laptop open to a chat window where her sister's words appeared, casual and familiar. They were discussing their parents' anniversary, laughing over small family jokes, weaving plans for the near future. Emma typed quickly, balancing her role as both chef and sister, occasionally glancing toward the sound of her children playing in another room. It was a portrait of domestic normalcy, the kind of scene that made outsiders believe in the safety of small towns. At 7:07 p.m., everything stopped. The typing ended mid-sentence, the cursor blinking like a silent alarm. Her sister waited for a reply, at first patient, then uncertain. Another message sent, this time shorter, almost probing. "Are you there?" No response. She tried again, her concern beginning to climb, but the screen remained still. It was a small interruption, the kind of thing that could easily be explained away. A child needing attention, food boiling over, the battery dying. But deep down, Katerina felt it was more than that. She called Emma's phone, straight to voicemail. She called again and again. Each time the unanswered ringing grew heavier, as if pressing down on her chest. Something was wrong, she knew it. On the road back from work, Thorne's car cut through the snowy landscape, headlights carving into the dark. He answered Katerina's desperate call with the kind of rational calm people cling to when they don't yet want to face fear. Maybe Emma had stepped away. Maybe her phone was charging. Maybe the kids distracted her. He wanted to believe in those explanations, wanted to protect Katerina from spiraling into panic. But even as he said those words, a quiet unease had already begun to crawl under his skin. When he finally pulled into the driveway, the first crack in his reassurance appeared. The front door, it wasn't locked. That never happened here, not in their home, not with Emma. She was cautious, always careful, always mindful with 2 children to protect. For Thorne, that unlocked door was the first whisper of something unspeakable waiting inside. He reached for the handle slowly, every nerve on edge, every instinct screaming that something about this night had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. The air inside was different. It didn't carry the familiar warmth of dinners cooking or children's laughter spilling down the stairs. Instead, it was thick, still, unnervingly quiet. He called out her name, his voice cutting through the silence, bouncing back to him without answer. His pulse quickened, his body tensing with the realization that silence wasn't ordinary here. It was dangerous. He stepped inside fully, and what greeted him was chaos. The living room bore no resemblance to the orderly space he had left that morning. Furniture overturned, belongings scattered across the floor, a violent disruption of the life they had so carefully built together. At first, a small part of him clung to denial. Maybe the children had been playing too roughly. Maybe it was just a mess, but the longer he stood there, the more undeniable the truth became. This was not play. This was destruction, deliberate and terrifying. And with every passing second, his fear deepened, clawing its way into his chest as he realized Emma and the children were nowhere in sight. That unlocked door was no accident. It was a message, silent and sinister. Someone had been here and nothing in their lives would ever be the same again. In that single moment, Arboga's illusion of safety shattered, and the first act of a nightmare began. The moment Thorne stepped inside, the atmosphere of the house felt wrong, as if the air itself had been rearranged by violence. He called out Emma's name, louder this time, expecting the familiar shuffle of her footsteps or the children's playful voices. Nothing. The silence pressed down like a weight. His eyes darted across the room, catching the sight of furniture knocked over, objects scattered, the once cozy home reduced to chaos. His heart pounded, a cold fear rising from the pit of his stomach. This wasn't the mess of children at play. It was the aftermath of something savage. Then his gaze shifted, and the world narrowed to a single point. There, sprawled across the floor, was Emma. Her body lay twisted, her skin pale under the harsh overhead light, and beneath her, a pool of blood spread slowly, soaking into the fabric of the rug. For a second, Thorne froze. His mind refused to accept what his eyes registered. This wasn't supposed to happen in their house, not to her, not to them. The warmth of the kitchen he had imagined on his drive home was gone, replaced by a horror so sharp it made his chest constrict. He stumbled forward, his breath catching in his throat, words tumbling out incoherently as he knelt beside her. Her face was barely recognizable under the blood and swelling. The love of his life, the woman he was going to marry, the mother of the children who had finally given him a family, was lying broken on the floor. He reached for her, desperate to feel a pulse, a sign of life. But before he could focus, another thought crashed into him with brutal force. The children. Where were Max and Saga? Panic surged, hotter and sharper than anything he had ever felt. His head snapped toward the staircase. Every instinct screamed at him that the silence upstairs was unnatural. He forced himself up, feet pounding against the steps, each one sounding like a gunshot in the suffocating quiet. The house seemed to close in around him as he climbed, his breaths ragged, his vision narrowing with dread. He reached the top landing, his heart slamming in his chest so violently it felt as if it might tear free. The hallway stretched out before him, the children's room door slightly ajar. He pushed it open, and what he saw extinguished whatever fragile hope he still carried. Max and Saga lay on the floor, their small bodies unnaturally still. Blood stained their pajamas, their hair, the very innocence of their being. Their faces, once so full of laughter and curiosity, were mutilated beyond recognition. For an instant, the world ceased to move. The sound drained out of the air, leaving only the roar of his own heartbeat in his ears. He staggered forward, dropping to his knees, reaching out with trembling hands that couldn't comprehend the devastation before him. He whispered their names, over and over, as if saying them could somehow pull them back, could undo what had been done. But the stillness of the room answered him with merciless clarity. His children, the little ones he had tucked into bed countless nights, were gone. In that instant, Thorne's universe collapsed. Everything he had fought for, everything he had dreamed of, shattered in front of him. The house that had been their sanctuary was now a tomb, every corner stained with horror. The love of his life was clinging to survival downstairs, and his children, their children, were lifeless before him. The narrator's words echo. In that moment, Thorne's entire world came crashing down. Nothing would ever be the same. The shock was total, the grief immediate, the horror absolute. What had been a safe home only hours before was now the scene of a massacre. And Thorne was left standing inside the wreckage of his family's life, knowing the nightmare was only beginning. The flashing blue and red lights of police cars painted the snow-covered street outside Emma's home, a grim reminder that the peace of Arboga had been shattered. Detectives and forensic teams swarmed the scene, their boots crunching against the icy ground as neighbors gathered at a distance, whispering in disbelief. Inside the house, every corner was scrutinized under harsh, artificial light. The living room, once a place of warmth, was now cataloged as evidence, its chaos frozen in photographs and sketches. Officers moved deliberately, documenting the overturned furniture, the splatters of blood, the remnants of violence that clung to every surface. Almost immediately, one fact stood out. Nothing had been taken. The wallets were still there. Jewelry sat untouched. Electronics had not been moved. Every item of value was in its rightful place, gleaming coldly under the forensic lamps. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't a burglary. This was personal. Someone had come not for money, not for possessions, but for destruction. It was an attack meant to annihilate, fueled by rage that went far beyond reason. Detectives pieced together the narrow timeline. Emma's final message to her sister was sent at 7:07 p.m. Thorne's call to emergency services came at 7:20 p.m. 13 minutes, barely enough time for someone to enter the house, unleash such brutality, and disappear without a trace. To investigators, that speed suggested planning. Whoever committed this crime knew the rhythms of the household, knew how little time they had, and struck with terrifying precision. That narrowed the list immediately. This wasn't a random drifter. It had to be someone close, someone familiar. Their first suspicion fell on Thorne. The fiancé who discovered the scene, the man who placed the desperate call to authorities, was also the one with the clearest access. Too often, detectives knew, the person who dialed for help was the one responsible. They retraced his steps, finishing his shift at work, leaving at the usual time, driving the familiar road home. They studied the 13-minute gap with clinical detachment, asking the questions every homicide team is trained to ask. Could he have slipped away unnoticed? Could the frantic phone call have been staged? For a while, the weight of suspicion pressed heavily on him. They checked his alibi, demanding proof that he hadn't walked through that door before 7:20. His co-workers confirmed he had completed his shift without leaving early. Security cameras along the route captured his car, time-stamped during the very window when the crime occurred. His face, caught in those blurry images, was the face of a man simply driving home, unaware of the horror awaiting him. Piece by piece, the suspicion began to crack. If Thorne was guilty, the evidence would have betrayed him. Instead, it defended him. With Thorne slipping off the list, the investigators turned toward the other man who had once lived inside Emma's world, Nicholas, her ex-husband. Their history was littered with fights, courtroom battles, accusations, custody disputes that left both sides bitter, exhausted, and wounded. On paper, Nicholas had motive, resentment, anger, perhaps revenge. Detectives knew that such emotions could twist into violence. And in cases like these, the past was often the clearest path toward the truth. They began to reconstruct Nicholas's day, where he had been, who had seen him, whether he could have traveled the distance in time to commit the attack. Every detail mattered. But almost immediately, obstacles arose. Witnesses placed him in another city entirely at the moment Emma's messages fell silent. He was miles away, separated by time and geography from the house in Arboga. Yet, despite the alibi, suspicion lingered. Detectives could not ignore the history between Emma and Nicholas, the arguments that once filled their lives, the tension that had driven them apart. They interrogated him again, probing for cracks in his story, for inconsistencies that might suggest a lie. But instead of the rage they expected, they found something else. A man shattered by grief. His children were gone, his ex-wife barely clinging to life, and he sat trembling, barely able to form coherent words. Still, in those first hours, the shadows of doubt hovered over him. For investigators grasping in the dark, Nicholas remained a figure of possibility, the only lead left when the obvious had been stripped away. The house told them nothing more. The forensic evidence was silent. No fingerprints, no foreign DNA, no trace of an intruder's path. Every theory dissolved into uncertainty, and Arboga itself seemed to sink deeper into fear. The case in its earliest stage was already collapsing under the weight of unanswered questions. A family had been destroyed, but the killer's face was still hidden, lurking somewhere in the silence. Emma's story, when traced backward, revealed a history already weighted with conflict and heartbreak. Before Arboga, before Thorne, her life had been entwined with Nicholas, the man who would become both her first love and later, her adversary. They were young, barely adults when they married, full of hope but unprepared for the weight of responsibility that came with it. For a time, their small family seemed complete. Max was born, a bright-eyed boy who filled the house with life, and soon after came Saga, a baby whose laughter could disarm even the worst days. On the surface, Emma had the dream she had once confided to her friends, a home, children, love. But reality was harsher than dreams. Immaturity, sleepless nights, and financial strain chipped away at their bond. Arguments that began as small disagreements grew sharper, escalating into bitter battles. Their marriage dissolved under the pressure, leaving not just two estranged partners, but two parents locked in a war neither wanted, yet neither could escape. Divorce papers may have ended their union, but custody hearings and courtrooms kept them bound together. The fight for Max and Saga became their battleground, with every decision feeling like a weapon, every ruling like a victory or a defeat. In those moments of anger, Nicholas had said things he later regretted. Words about wanting to take the children away, about Emma not being fit, about her choices. Emma, in turn, fought fiercely, unwilling to lose what she cherished most. For detectives investigating the massacre, this history was a red flag waving in the dark. Here was motive, jealousy, resentment, the bitterness of a man who might have wanted revenge. In the early hours of the case, Nicholas became more than just an ex-husband. He became a possible suspect. They looked at the records. Could Nicholas have driven to Arboga, carried out the attack, and vanished back into anonymity in time to establish an alibi? Could the rage of a failed marriage have turned into something far more sinister? Detectives pressed harder, combing through timelines, phone records, eyewitness accounts. But the evidence didn't bend to their suspicion. Nicholas was in another city when Emma's sister's chat window went silent at 7:07 p.m. Witnesses placed him miles away, far from Arboga, and the timeline made it impossible for him to be the one inside that house. The frustration in the investigation grew heavy. With Nicholas cleared, the only clear lead evaporated and detectives were left staring at the void of unanswered questions. No fingerprints, no foreign DNA, no missing valuables, no weapon. Just a scene of carnage and silence. In the absence of suspects, the police faced not just their own doubts, but the full weight of a terrified community demanding answers. News spread quickly. Arboga, with its quiet streets and small-town rhythm, was not built to withstand such horror. Neighbors who once left their doors unlocked began checking them 2, 3, even 4 times each night. Windows that have been open for fresh air stayed shut, bolted tight. Parents stopped letting their children play in the yards, keeping them close, watchful eyes following every movement. The playgrounds fell silent. The streets emptied before nightfall. The fear was tangible, crawling into every corner of the town. The media amplified the dread. Headlines painted the crime as an inexplicable act of savagery. Reporters asked the same questions that haunted the police. Who would want to destroy a young mother and her children? Why this family? Why in Arboga? Each article deepened the sense of vulnerability. Each broadcast reminded the people that the killer was still out there. Detectives felt the pressure mounting with every passing day. Politicians called for answers, journalists demanded progress, and families whispered their own theories. Yet the investigation stood paralyzed, chasing shadows of a past that provided no real solutions. Emma's broken marriage, her custody battles, her ex-husband's bitterness, they were ghosts of another life. Painful, yes, but not the explanation for the blood spilled inside that house. And so, the case stood at a crossroads. With Nicholas ruled out and Thorne already cleared, suspicion had no anchor. Arboga held its breath, caught in the grip of terror. The killer had walked into a home, destroyed a family, and vanished into the night, leaving no trace. For the people of this small town, safety had become an illusion, and the shadows of the past did nothing to comfort them. Instead, they sharpened the fear that lingered, whispering that whoever committed the atrocity might not be finished. Just when it seemed the investigation had reached a dead end, a sliver of light pierced the darkness. Days after the attack, police received a call from a man who lived near Emma's street. He hadn't come forward immediately, thinking perhaps what he saw wasn't important. But the weight of the news, the brutal assault on a young mother and her children, made him rethink every detail of that night. He told detectives he had been walking past Emma's house around 7 o'clock, only minutes before her sister's chat messages abruptly stopped. What he described sent a ripple through the entire investigative team. He saw a figure, cloaked entirely in black, standing on the sidewalk outside Emma's front door. The hood was pulled up, the person's posture tense, hesitant, as if debating whether to knock or walk away. It was the kind of behavior that catches the eye because it feels unnatural, out of place. The witness continued on his errand, stopping briefly at a nearby supermarket. When he returned, no more than 10 minutes later, the hesitation was gone. He saw the same figure sprinting out of Emma's home, running with purpose, before leaping into a car that sped off into the night. The man admitted he couldn't make out a face, couldn't identify the car model in the blur of motion. But there was one detail he was certain about, a detail that cut through all the uncertainty. The figure wasn't a man. It was a woman. He could tell from the build, the movement, the way the figure carried itself. And in that instant, the case transformed. For detectives, this was the first tangible lead since the massacre. Until then, suspicion had circled around the men in Emma's life, her fiancé, her ex-husband, the usual suspects in domestic tragedies. But now, the compass swung in an entirely new direction. The image of a hooded woman poised at Emma's door just before the attack was something they could not ignore. For the first time, investigators considered the possibility that this was not a crime driven by a man's rage, but by a woman's obsession, jealousy, or vengeance. The significance was enormous. A woman entering the home narrowed the field dramatically, especially in a small town like Arboga, where everyone knew each other. Detectives began drafting lists, combing through the web of relationships around Emma and Thorne. They asked, who were the women close to them? Friends, co-workers, neighbors, old acquaintances. Who might harbor a grudge? Who might feel threatened by Emma's new life? Who might see her happiness as something to destroy? Interviews began again, but this time with sharper focus. Female colleagues of Thorne were questioned. Women who had crossed paths with Emma at her children's daycare, at the grocery store, in their quiet community, were scrutinized. The police didn't say it out loud, but privately they knew. Attacks of this magnitude, carried out with such brutality and precision, didn't come from nowhere. They came from an emotional storm, hate, envy, or betrayal. And often that storm had been building quietly for years. The townspeople too felt the shift. When news broke that a witness had seen a woman, fear twisted into something darker. The idea of a faceless intruder was terrifying enough, but the possibility that she could be someone they knew, someone who blended in at the supermarket or church, turned suspicion inward. Suddenly, every stranger's glance lingered too long, every unfamiliar car parked on the street felt ominous. Arboga's peace was gone, replaced by whispers and sideways looks, each person wondering if the killer walked among them. For detectives, the pressure doubled. They could not afford another dead end. The witness's account was fragile. It lacked a license plate, a car description, even a face, but it was the only crack in the wall of silence surrounding the case. They would have to push through it, to tear apart the personal histories of everyone in Emma's orbit, to find the woman who had stood at that door, hooded and waiting, at the exact moment when a young family's life was stolen. And so the investigation pivoted for the first time. The shadow hovering over Arboga was not just any intruder. It was a woman, and she had vanished into the night with her secret intact. 10 days after the massacre, the hospital room where Emma lay became the most closely guarded place in Sweden. Machines hummed steadily beside her, their rhythm a fragile promise that life still clung to her broken body. For days, doctors had spoken in hushed tones, warning her family that survival did not guarantee recovery. Brain damage, paralysis, memory loss, all of it loomed like dark clouds. Yet on that morning, when her eyelids fluttered open, the impossible happened. Emma returned. At first, she was like a ghost awakening in unfamiliar skin. Her eyes darted, glassy, unfocused, searching for anchors in a world that felt foreign. Faces leaned over her, but she struggled to attach names, her lips refusing to form words. The trauma had buried her memories deep, leaving her with fragments too fragile to touch. The detectives who stood quietly at the doorway understood. The case now rested on the mind of this young mother. If she remembered, they might finally find the ghost who had walked into her home. If she didn't, the nightmare would remain unsolved. For days, Emma drifted in and out of awareness. Her mind fogged, the weight of her losses hidden from her by doctors who feared the truth might shatter her progress. But the human spirit is stubborn, and memory, even when buried under trauma, has a way of clawing back to the surface. Slowly, images returned. The feeling of the cold floor beneath her feet, the faint echo of laughter from her children in another room. And then, like shards of glass piercing through the haze, came the memory of the door. A knock. The sound still vibrated inside her ears when she closed her eyes. Detective sat beside her bed when she finally whispered the first clear recollection. A figure, cloaked in black, standing in the doorway. Emma's breath quickened as her mind reached deeper. She could see the hood, the shadowed face, the way the stranger's presence filled the hallway with menace. She whispered again, her voice breaking. She spoke. The detectives leaned closer. What did she say? Emma closed her eyes, forcing the memory to surface. The words came, trembling, unmistakable. My name is Tina. And then the explosion of pain, the hammer descending like thunder, the world collapsing into blood and silence. That detail, so precise, so human, cut through every doubt. Emma had not imagined this phantom. She had seen her, heard her. And when investigators placed photos in front of her one by one, Emma's hands shook. She hesitated at none of them until her eyes landed on a single face. The transformation was immediate. Her breath caught, her pupils widened, tears welled in her eyes. She raised a trembling finger and pointed. The name slipped from her lips, raw and certain. Her, Christine Schürrer. A name that meant little to most in Arboga, but to Thorn it was a ghost from his past. A woman from Germany with whom he had once shared a brief romance, a woman he thought he had left behind. Now, revealed in Emma's recognition, she was not just a shadow from yesterday, but the figure who had shattered their future. The moment was electric. Detectives exchanged glances, the weight of months of frustration breaking into clarity. The hooded figure was no longer anonymous. Emma's trembling recognition turned the faceless monster into flesh and blood. Christine was no longer a rumor, no longer a possibility. She was the enemy, the intruder, the executioner who had ripped children from their beds and left a mother for dead. In that sterile hospital room, justice took its first breath. Emma's memory, fragile yet piercing, gave the case a direction, a face, a name. And with it came the chilling realization. This was not the work of a random intruder. This was revenge, long planned and merciless. Emma's words had pulled the monster out of the shadows, and with them, the hunt for Christine Schürrer began. Christine Schürrer's name, when it finally surfaced in the investigation, carried with it a history that made the pieces of the puzzle click together with disturbing precision. She was 31 at the time of the attack, born in Germany, raised in a household fractured by abandonment. When she was 11, her father walked out, leaving behind a daughter who would spend her life chasing the void he created. Those who knew her later often spoke of her intelligence, her charm, her adventurous streak that carried her from New York to Greece to Sweden. But beneath the surface was something darker, an obsessive need to control, a suffocating possessiveness, and a fear of rejection so profound it became her defining trait. Her story with Thorn began not in Sweden, but in the sunlit landscape of Greece. Thorn was on vacation, Christine worked at a hotel. What began as a brief fling, a few days of passion between strangers, became in Christine's mind the beginning of forever. For Thorn, it was a holiday romance, destined to fade with a return flight home. But for Christine, it was a bond carved into her very identity. She latched on, convinced this man would become her anchor, the antidote to the instability of her past. When Thorn ended it after a few months, Christine unraveled. Rejection ignited something primal inside her. She bombarded him with messages, letters, pleas for another chance. She showed up in Sweden, uninvited, forcing her way into his life, unwilling to let go. What Thorn saw as boundaries, she saw as betrayal. And when he tried to push her away more firmly, she escalated. She staged suicide attempts, swallowing pills, collapsing in places she knew he would find her, pulling him back into her chaos through guilt and fear. Every act was a performance designed to keep his attention, no matter the cost. When desperation wasn't enough, she resorted to fabrication. She claimed she had borne his child, a child supposedly given up for adoption. She painted a picture of tragedy, weaving stories about a baby with a rare blood disorder who might need his help someday. For Thorn, the math never added up. The dates didn't make sense. The details shifted with every question. But Christine clung to the lie, using it as her final tether to him, her last weapon to keep herself entwined in his life. Psychologists who later examined her case pointed to a classic profile: abandonment trauma that metastasized into obsession. The child who had been left behind by her father grew into a woman who could not endure being left by anyone. Each rejection, each closed door reawakened the old wound. To her, love was not companionship, it was survival. And when survival was threatened, her affection twisted into hatred. It was the same pattern repeated over and over. intense infatuation, escalating control, inevitable collapse, and finally retaliation. With Thorne, however, the stakes were higher. He wasn't just another lover who slipped through her fingers. He represented the family she thought she had been denied all her life. And when Emma entered the picture, young, radiant, with 2 children who adored Thorne, Christine's fantasy shattered completely. In her mind, Emma was not just a rival. She was the thief who had stolen her one chance at permanence. The obsession mutated into a vendetta. Christine stalked Emma's life from the shadows, collecting photos, memorizing routines, writing venomous passages in her diary. Every step Emma took with Thorne and the children festered in Christine's psyche, deepening the conviction that if she could not have him, no one would. This was not a crime born in a single night of madness. It was the culmination of years of festering obsession, the slow decay of a mind that transformed longing into loathing. Christine Schürrer had turned her abandonment into a weapon, her heartbreak into a blueprint for revenge. In the end, what she called love was nothing more than control, and when control slipped from her grasp, she chose destruction. When police finally stepped into Christine's apartment, they knew they were entering the private sanctuary of someone who had lived and breathed obsession. What they uncovered inside stripped away the last veil of doubt. Tucked in drawers, scattered across tables, hidden between stacks of papers, there it was. Evidence not of a fleeting impulse, but of a plan executed with chilling calculation. Her diary was the first revelation. Page after page bled with venom, her handwriting jagged and forceful, dripping with hatred toward Emma and her children. She didn't simply vent anger, she chronicled them. She wrote about the times Thorne left for work, the hours Emma spent at home, even the sounds of the children playing. Every detail of their lives was dissected, scheduled, reduced to an itinerary of surveillance. It wasn't just anger, it was fixation sharpened into strategy. Beside the diary, investigators found dozens of photographs. Emma at the market, Emma with her children, the front of the house taken from different angles, as though Christine had been rehearsing the approach. Most disturbing of all was a detailed sketch of the interior floor plan, each room mapped with notes on doors, windows, and sightlines. It was as if she had been constructing a manual for murder. On her computer, the search history spoke louder than any confession could. Queries for how to erase blood traces, how to hide DNA, how to destroy evidence lined the records. The coldness of those words, typed in the sterile glow of a screen, revealed a mind preparing meticulously for violence. It was no spontaneous rage, it was premeditation, layered and deliberate. Then came the physical link that tied her directly to the scene. Investigators had preserved a partial shoe print left on the blood-stained floor of Emma's home. In Christine's closet sat the matching pair of sneakers. The tread aligned perfectly, the size identical. It was as if she had carried a piece of the crime scene back into her apartment, unaware that one small impression would betray her. Finally, a former roommate delivered the final nail. She recalled that in the days surrounding the crime, her hammer had gone missing from a shared toolbox. At first, she thought little of it. Tools were misplaced all the time, but now, in the shadow of discovery, the timing was unmistakable. The very weapon investigators believed had been used to bludgeon Emma and her children had disappeared under Christine's watch. Every fragment of evidence told the same story. The hatred in her diary, the stalking in her photos, the cold calculations in her searches, the footprint that screamed her presence, the missing hammer that matched the brutality of the wounds. Each piece alone was damning. Together, they were overwhelming. The puzzle was complete, and Christine stood at its center, no longer the shadow in a hood, but the architect of a nightmare. When Christine Schürrer was finally brought into the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted into something surreal. This was not the image of a remorseful woman confronted with the weight of her crimes. Instead, she entered with a strange confidence, smiling faintly, even waving to the crowd as if she were the center of a spectacle, rather than the accused in a brutal double murder case. Throughout the proceedings, she treated the moment like a performance, her demeanor almost mocking. When the prosecution displayed photographs of the crime scene, images so devastating that many in the gallery looked away, Christine laughed. It wasn't nervous laughter, it was cold, deliberate, and it chilled everyone present. Her defense team seized on the only openings they had. They argued relentlessly that no direct forensic link tied her to the house that night. No DNA, no strands of hair, no drops of her blood. They hammered at the missing murder weapon, insisting that without it, the case was a house built on sand. They suggested Emma's testimony, scarred by trauma and memory loss, could not be trusted as solid evidence. In their framing, everything was circumstantial, woven together by theory rather than proof. But the prosecution had prepared for this moment. They laid out a case not built on one piece of evidence, but on the overwhelming weight of many. They walked the jury through Christine's diary, filled with hatred for Emma and her children. They showed the photographs of Emma's house, the hand-drawn maps, the obsessive search history on Christine's computer. They reminded the court of the footprint that matched her shoes and the missing hammer reported by her former roommate. And then they presented the one detail that could never be erased: Emma's recognition. Emma herself entered the courtroom, fragile but unbroken. Her voice trembled as she described the hooded figure. The words whispered, "I am Tina," before the blows rained down. She told the jury about the sensation of her body collapsing, about the sound of her children's cries fading into silence. And as she faced Christine across the room, memories returned in fragments, sharpening into horror. She recalled the hammer descending again and again, her desperate, failing attempts to protect Max and Saga. The silence in the courtroom grew heavy. Emma's testimony was not simply words, it was grief laid bare. Her tears were not evidence in the technical sense, but they carried the undeniable truth of a mother's nightmare. The prosecution did not need to embellish. The pain spoke for itself. As Emma's voice broke, the jury saw the stark contrast. A mother reliving the most agonizing moments of her life, and across from her, a woman smirking, unrepentant, watching with cold amusement. The clash of those two images, the survivor and the destroyer, became the emotional high point of the trial. Whatever doubts lingered began to wither under the sheer gravity of that confrontation. The courtroom no longer saw Christine as a victim of circumstance. They saw her as the architect of deliberate cruelty, and with that realization, the path toward justice became inescapable. The courtroom held its breath as the judge delivered the final words. Christine Schürrer was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the families in the room, it was not triumph but a somber relief, the assurance that the woman who had torn apart so many lives would never walk free again. The decision came unanimously. The jury saw through her performance, through the smirks and the calculated indifference. The evidence had spoken louder than her denial, and Emma's voice had carried the weight of truth. As guards moved to escort her out, Christine remained as she had throughout the trial. Cold, almost amused, her face betraying no regret. She walked with the composure of someone who refused to acknowledge defeat, her eyes scanning the gallery as if daring them to look away. That absence of remorse, that chilling detachment was what struck those who watched most deeply. This was not the madness of a mind unraveling in a single night. It was the outcome of methodical obsession, of deliberate choices carried out with ruthless precision. In 2012, she was transferred to a women's prison in Germany, far from Arboga, but still shadowed by the crimes that defined her. Behind walls and barbed wire, she faded from the public eye, yet the memory of her cruelty lingered. Psychologists who examined her case described not a fleeting burst of rage, but the profile of a woman who embodied control, calculation, and vengeance. This was the most disturbing truth of all. Christine was not insane. She was not overtaken by uncontrollable impulse. She was fully aware, fully conscious, and entirely deliberate. Her actions were the work of someone who turned rejection into a vendetta, who chose annihilation over acceptance. And in that, the true horror lay, not in madness, but in the cold clarity of her design. In the years that followed, Emma's recovery was slow, marked by both physical struggle and emotional scars that would never truly heal. Yet she refused to let the darkness define her. With Thorn by her side, she learned to walk again, to rebuild the fragments of a life that had been shattered. In 2010, they married, a quiet ceremony that symbolized resilience rather than celebration. Together, they brought 2 more children into the world, children who would grow up in the shadow of loss, yet surrounded by a fierce love born from survival. Nicholas, too, tried to rebuild. He eventually remarried and welcomed a daughter, creating a new chapter even as grief for Max and Saga lingered in the corners of his life. For both parents, moving forward never meant forgetting. The memory of their children lived in every gesture, every silence, every glance toward the empty spaces where laughter once rang. For Emma, each birthday missed, each milestone unseen, was a reminder of what had been stolen. But she chose not to drown in bitterness. Instead, she carried her pain like a scar, visible, permanent, but proof that she had endured. From a crime rooted in hatred, Emma carved out a future defined by love. Yet no matter how much healing time allowed, the loss of Max and Saga would forever remain etched into her heart, a silent wound she would carry for the rest of her days.